Savack, the acronym in Persian for the Organization of Intelligence and Security of the Country, was what Iran's equivalent of the CIA was known by before the 1979 Islamic Revolution. It was set up in 1957, 16 years after the Shah came to the throne, after Iran's parliament voted to establish a domestic security and counterintelligence at a time when all countries, including the respectable democracies in the West, also had similar organizations. Yet the Western press and the leftist intellectuals portrayed Savack as a brutal institution that savagely tortured political prisoners. They also portrayed Savack as a solely owned property of the Shah, as if he personally micromanaged every single operation in that large organization. The Time magazine described it as the Shah's most hated and feared institution. The Federation of American Scientists said the Savack was guilty of torture and execution of thousands of political prisoners. And in a 1976 document, Amnesty International stated that the Shah's Savack was one of the worst human rights violators in the world. Keep in mind that at the time, the KGB in the Soviet Union and the Stasi in East Germany controlled and surveilled private lives of millions of ordinary citizens, and gulags were still operational in the Soviet Union. Yet the Savack was portrayed in the Western media as a more brutal organization. But how much of what was being said in the West about the Savack was fact, and how much of it was myths and lies propagated by the Shah's enemies, particularly by the Islamists and the global left under the influence of the Soviet Union during the Cold War? One of the main proponents of Savack's notoriety, who led an effective smear campaign against the Savack in the West, was an Iranian poet and writer by the name of Reza Barahani. In 1973, he was detained in Iran for 3 months for pro-communist propaganda. He left Iran for America after his release. There he managed to publish a 4-page story about the cruelties of Savack in the soft porn Penthouse magazine's January issue in 1977. His detailed claims of how political prisoners in Iran were being systematically raped by Savack was borderline erotic. No wonder it was published in such a magazine and so widely read. Let me read you some of what Barahani described in his Penthouse article. He refers to a metallurgy student in prison without naming him, only refers to him as BE. And then he says, "He and I would go to the same booth in the showers. The door was left open. The guards loved to watch his ass. They would even point it out to each other and giggle passionately. I could see that the guards already had hard-ons and the beads of saliva played on their mouths. During these moments, BE would ask me to help him. I would stand by the door of the booth with my hairy back to the guards, obstructing their erotic vision of passion with my own ass. It seemed they didn't fancy my ass." This is just... Barahani's description of Savack tortures became more bizarre. He even accused them of cannibalism and how a young political prisoner was killed and then his flesh was served to other political prisoners for food. Barahani quickly found backers and supporters amongst the US leftists and liberals, like the American lawyer Ramsey Clark, who occupied senior positions in John F. Kennedy and Lyndon B. Johnson administrations, serving as the US Attorney General. Despite his outrageous claims bordering on comedy, Barahani even testified in the Congress against the Shah and the Savack. Barahani's irrational and unrealistic claims were believed and swallowed by the leftist intelligentsia in the West, who cheered any evidence that could be used to bash and condemn the so-called pro-imperialist Shah of Iran. In 1979, when Ayatollah Khomeini returned to Iran, Barahani wrote, "When Imam Khomeini comes, no one will lie again. No one will lock their doors. No one will pay bribes anymore. All will be brothers. There will be no more queues for bread or fuel." Despite the obvious pandering to be in Khomeini's good book, like many leftist intellectuals, Barahani had to flee Iran shortly after the 1979 Islamic Revolution and ended up living in exile in Canada until he died. As for Ramsey Clark, after he left public office, he offered advice for the legal defense of brutal dictators like Saddam Hussein and Libya's Colonel Gaddafi. Apparently, he was particularly sensitive to claims of human rights abuse by pro-West leaders, but not so much about atrocities committed by anti-imperialist dictators. Savack was also falsely accused of extrajudicial murders of some prominent figures amongst the Shah's dissidents. Many of these cases have now been proven to be complete fabrications and campaigns of disinformation. One of them was Samad Behrangi, a Marxist primary school teacher who became famous for his children's stories. Savack was accused of drowning him in a river bordering Iran and Soviet Union. After the revolution, his close friend and comrade who was with him on the day he drowned admitted publicly that it was nothing but an accident.
5-6 متر مونده بودم صمد رفت زیرا.
Ali Shariati was another dissident against the Shah. He formulated a new concept that offered a Marxist interpretation of Islam, which became known as Islamic Marxism. Shariati died in June 1977 in London. The Shah's opponents again accused Savack of poisoning him. The truth, however, was that he was a chain smoker and died of a heart attack. Again, his close friends admitted this after the revolution.
به نظر می آمد که به مرگ طبیعی از دنیا رفته. مرگ طبیعی یعنی با سکته.
It is important to know that I'm not saying the Savack always acted lawfully and their agents never abused their powers. I don't think you can say that about any security force, but undoubtedly there was a huge disinformation campaign against the Savack to smear the Shah of Iran. Needless to say, possible human rights abuses by some Savack agents were unlawful and must be condemned. But it is important to have a fair and balanced approach when making judgments about history within the right historical context. And to keep things in context, look at what was happening at the time of the Shah, both in the West and in the neighbouring countries of Iran. Even the CIA and similar security organisations in Western liberal democracies routinely committed torture and abused human rights. In developing countries or behind the Iron Curtain, the situation was even more abhorrent. To the north of Iran, there was the KGB as the sword and shield of the Soviet Communist Party. To the west, there was the Iraqi al-Mukhabarat as the iron fist of the Ba'ath Party. Turkey was ruled by a military junta. All had far more brutal regimes than the constitutional monarchy in Iran. The Shah was accused of having as many as 350,000 political prisoners and having killed 100,000 people. Independent investigations after the revolution, including the new Islamic regime's own findings, was that the maximum number of political prisoners under the Shah was no more than 3,700, and in all of the Shah's 37-year reign, the number of people killed was less than 3,000. Almost all of whom were members of Islamist and or Marxist armed organizations who routinely attacked and terrorized civilians and also assassinated officials such as the Shah himself on 2 occasions and 3 prime ministers, several other government ministers and intellectuals. And finally, let's have a look at some of the people who were imprisoned under the Shah. Prisoners like Ayatollah Sadr Khalkhali, Ayatollah Khomeini's henchman, known as the hanging judge, responsible for summary executions of thousands after the overthrow of the Shah, including teenagers and homosexual Iranians. Asadullah Lajavardi, who became the head of the notorious Evin prison after the 1979 revolution in Iran, responsible for devising the most brutal tortures. And the current supreme leader of the Islamic Republic, Ali Khamenei, who has led one of the most repressive and brutal religious dictatorships for more than 3 decades. You can add to this list hundreds of other Islamist and Marxist figures, each with a lengthy history of armed resistance, assassinations, setting cinema theatres on fire and other terrorist activities. In particular, founders and leaders of the MEK who assassinated American advisors and technicians in Iran were amongst those arrested and imprisoned by the Savack. Less than 4 months before the 1979 revolution, one of the top officers of the Savack warned, if the Savack is dissolved, terrorists will take over Iran. Regardless of our favourable or unfavourable judgment about Savack's track record, it is time to ask ourselves, was it really as brutal as was portrayed in the West?